Welcome back to Horror Galaxy. Tonight, I have 6 scary camping in Alaska horror story for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Horror Galaxy, you don't walk alone. I was halfway back from the river when I noticed the tent flap ahead of me, hanging open like someone had just stepped out for a second. I remember stopping mid-step, my boots sinking slightly into the mud, because that tent hadn't been there that morning. I was sure of it. I'd walked this stretch twice already, hauling gear, and the gravel bar had been empty, except for my own setup downstream. My first thought was annoyance, that someone had camped too close without asking. My second thought came when I got closer and felt heat roll out of the tent like a breath. I stood there listening, expecting to hear a voice, a cough, something human. The flap moved slightly in the breeze, but there was no sound inside. I leaned forward and put my hand against the canvas. It was warm. Not sun-warmed. Body warm, like someone had been lying there moments ago. I called out, loud enough to sound confident, asking if anyone was around. My voice came back flat and empty. That was when I noticed the boots. A single set of boot prints led away from the tent, straight toward the tree line. Fresh, sharp edges. Whoever made them hadn't been gone long. I stepped inside the tent before I could talk myself out of it. A sleeping bag lay unzipped, still puffed with trapped heat. A dent in the pillow. A small stove set up, fuel canister still attached, not even cool yet. No pack, no boots, no jacket. I remember thinking nobody walks into the woods here without boots unless something is very wrong. I shouted again, louder, and this time my voice shook. I followed the prints for maybe 20 steps before they stopped. Not faded, not mixed with anything else. Just ended, like the person had stepped off the ground. I stood there staring, my heart thudding hard enough to make me lightheaded, telling myself there had to be an explanation. I told myself maybe they doubled back, maybe I was missing something obvious, but the forest floor was soft and marked easily. There was nothing. No return trail, no sidestep, just gone. I backed up slowly, feeling watched without seeing anything. I didn't run, but every instinct wanted me to. Back at the tent, I called out again, then louder still, using words I wouldn't normally use, trying to sound authoritative. Nothing answered. I waited, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more, sitting on my haunches, eyes fixed on the trees. The tent stayed warm the whole time. That detail stuck with me. Heat doesn't linger that long unless it's fresh. Eventually I did what felt responsible. I packed up what I could from inside the tent and left it neatly by the entrance, thinking if the person came back, they'd see someone had been there and tried to help. I returned to my own camp, my hands clumsy, my thoughts looping. I kept replaying the missing boots, the stop tracks. I told myself not to invent things. This was Alaska. People got hurt. People panicked. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound felt close. At some point, I heard footsteps slow, careful. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening for fabric. For a zipper, for anything. Nothing came. When I finally forced myself to look out, there was no one there. But the ground showed prints. Bare feet. Fresh. At first light, I went back with my rifle slung tight and my nerves shot. The other tent was still there, still open, still empty, still warm. That was impossible, and my mind kept trying to reject it. like it was a bad measurement, a mistake. I followed the bare footprints this time. They led to the same place as before. They ended the same way. No scuff, no disturbance. Just nothing. I broke then. I started yelling, not words, just sound, anger and fear spilling out, because I needed something to make sense. When I stopped, the quiet felt heavier than before. I packed my camp fast, sloppy, leaving things behind I shouldn't have. Before I left, I did one last thing. I dug under the other tent, shallow. Where the ground felt wrong, I don't know why I did it. I think part of me needed proof. I found boots, a jacket, a pack folded neatly, like someone had taken them off on purpose. No body, no blood, nothing else. I covered it back up and left. I reported it in town. People listened politely. A ranger took notes. Searchers came later. They found the buried gear. They found no tracks, no sign of a struggle, no remains. Eventually, the case closed. Exposure. Accident. Unlikely but possible. I know what I saw. I know that tent stayed warm far longer than it should have. I know tracks don't just stop. I never camped alone again after that. Some places don't take you all at once. Sometimes they let you walk away. Just so you understand what could have happened if they decided otherwise. I was crouched by the fire, feeding in a thin strip of driftwood, when I heard it answer me. The crackle came a half-second after mine, sharp and clean, like an echo that shouldn't exist. I froze with my hands still extended, watching my own flames jump. When they settled, the sound came again from somewhere behind me. Same rhythm, same intensity, close enough to feel deliberate. I stood up slowly, every muscle tight, and listened. When my fire popped, the other one popped back. My first thought was another camper. I hadn't seen anyone on the hike in, but this was the backcountry, not another planet. People wondered. I called out a greeting, trying to keep my voice light, like I wasn't suddenly calculating how fast I could pack. My words vanished into the trees. No answer. I shifted my weight, boots grinding softly, and the other fire responded with the same soft grind, like someone mirroring me. I felt a twist of unease settle low in my stomach. I walked a few steps away from my fire, eyes scanning the dark for glow or sparks. There was nothing. No orange flicker, no smoke, no smell. Just the sound. I stopped, and the sound stopped. I crouched, poked my fire again, and waited. Crackle, crackle. The second one answered, perfectly timed, like it had been waiting for permission. I laughed once, short and sharp, more reflex than humor. Okay, I said, out loud, to myself. Enough. I grabbed my headlamp and swept it across the clearing and into the trees. The beam cut through branches and trunks, caught on nothing human. No tent, no cooler, no circle of stones. I walked toward where the sound seemed to come from, counting my steps without meaning to. 10, 15, 20. The sound grew no louder, no closer. When I stopped, it stopped. When I turned back toward my camp and snapped a photo, the other fire snapped too. A quick hiss like it didn't like being ignored. I went back to my fire and sat down hard. My heart was beating fast enough to make my hands shake. I told myself it was a trick of acoustics, something bouncing off the terrain, even though I knew fire didn't echo like that. I forced myself to eat, chewing without tasting, keeping my eyes on the dark. Every movement I made got an answer. Every pause was mirrored. It felt less like sound and more like a conversation I hadn't agreed to have. After a while, I tried an experiment. I tossed a handful of dirt onto my fire, smothering it until the flames died and only embers glowed. The answering fire went quiet too. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, and for a moment I felt relief. Then, slowly, carefully, the other fire began to crackle again. My own fire stayed dead. I stared into the dark, my chest tight, understanding something I didn't want to. Whatever it was, it didn't need my fire to exist. I packed then, fast and clumsy, shoving gear into my bag without folding or thinking. The sound followed me, always behind, always just out of sight, matching the rustle of fabric and the snap of buckles. When I slung my pack on, it slung back. When I stepped away from camp, it stepped with me. I stopped walking and said, quietly, I'm leaving. The sound stopped too, like it was listening. I didn't run. Running felt wrong, like it would invite something. I walked, steady and straight, keeping my breathing even. The trail was faint, but I knew the direction. After a few minutes, the sound started again, farther back now, still matching me but slower, like it was losing interest or patience. I didn't look back. I focused on the feel of the ground under my boots, the weight of the pack, the simple fact of moving forward. It followed me for a long time. I don't know how long. Time stretched thin, warped by fear and focus. Eventually, without warning, the sound stopped. Not gradually, not fading, just gone. I kept walking for a long while after that, afraid to trust the quiet. When I finally reached a spot where I felt safe enough to stop, I set my pack down and listened until my ears rang. Nothing answered me. I slept in fits that night, waking at every imagined noise, my dreams full of mirrored movements and sounds that lagged just enough to feel wrong. In the morning, I hiked out without taking a single photo, my camera heavy and useless against my chest. Back in town, I told a ranger what happened. He listened, polite but distant, and said sometimes sound carried strangely out there. He suggested stress, isolation, imagination. I nodded and thanked him and never argued. I didn't need him to believe me. I knew what I'd experienced. It wasn't random. It wasn't a ghost story. It was something that responded, that paid attention, that chose when to speak back and when to stop. I never camped alone after that. Some things don't chase you. They just show you they could. And that's enough to make sure you never give them the chance again. I woke up because I couldn't breathe right, like the air was pushing against my chest instead of going in. I tried to roll onto my side and felt the rough ground under my shoulder, cold and wrong. My eyes snapped open, and for a second I didn't understand what I was seeing. Half my sleeping bag was outside the tent. The zipper edge dug into my ribs, and the bottom of the bag stretched tight, pulled straight toward the open flap. I didn't scream. I remember that clearly. I just froze, staring at the dark opening, my heart hammering so loud, I was sure it would wake my parents. I tried to pull myself back inside, digging my fingers into the fabric, but the bag didn't move. It felt stuck, like something heavy was pressing down on the part outside. Not tugging, not shaking, just weight, solid and patient. I whispered for my mom. My voice came out thin and shaky, like it didn't belong to me. The weight didn't change. I could feel it through the sleeping bag, a steady pressure, enough to keep me pinned. I thought about animals, because that was easier than thinking about anything else. Bears were always talked about, even though my dad said they stayed away from camps. I told myself it was just something leaning, maybe a log that fell, even though I knew that didn't make sense. I tried again to pull back, harder this time, using my heels to push against the tent floor. The bag shifted an inch, maybe less, and the pressure increased immediately, pressing me flatter, squeezing the air out of me until spots danced in my vision. I stopped moving. My chest burned. Tears slid down my temples into my ears. And I remember being embarrassed about that even then. Like crying would make it worse somehow. From outside the tent came a sound I still can't describe properly. Not breathing. Not footsteps. More like fabric dragging slowly over dirt. Careful and controlled. Whatever was outside adjusted when I stopped struggling, like it was listening to my body instead of my ears. I clenched my fists and waited, counting in my head the way my teacher had taught us to calm down. I didn't get very far. The pressure eased just a little, enough for me to suck in a shallow breath. I took another, slower this time, afraid that sudden movement would bring the weight back full force. My mind raced, looking for something I could do without moving much. My flashlight was near my head, tucked into the corner of the tent. I slid my hand toward it, inch by inch. The sleeping bag shifted a fraction, and the pressure returned, heavier than before. I stopped again, my hand inches from the light. That was when I heard my dad snore from the other side of the tent. It was the most normal sound in the world, and it almost broke me. I wanted to yell, to kick, to do anything, but I knew instinctively that noise was a bad idea. Whatever was outside hadn't left. It was still there. Holding me like this was just how things were for now. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. My arms tingled from staying still. My throat hurt from holding back sound. Slowly, carefully, the weight shifted again. Not away, just different. I felt the sleeping bag slide another inch inward, like it was being allowed rather than pulled. I took the chance. I shoved hard, all at once, twisting my body sideways. The pressure vanished instantly. The bag slid free, and I scrambled backward, slamming into my dad's side, screaming his name at the top of my lungs. The tent exploded into chaos. My mom sat up, my dad grabbed for the lantern, voices overlapping, sharp and scared. I pointed at the flap, sobbing so hard I could barely speak, telling them something had me, something was outside. My dad yanked the zipper open and shone the light around. There was nothing there. No animal, no shadow, just the dark and the ground. They checked everything, the tent, the campsite, the area around us. My sleeping bag lay half outside like I'd said, dirty along the bottom. Stretched longer than it should have been. My dad frowned at that, tugging on it, then let it go. He didn't say anything, but his face looked different, tighter. They brought me between them, wrapped in a blanket, and didn't let me sleep alone the rest of the night. In the morning, they found marks in the dirt where my sleeping bag had been. Not tracks. Just a long, smooth indentation, like something heavy had rested there for a while. No claw marks. No footprints. My dad took pictures, then covered them up before breaking camp early. We left without finishing breakfast. Years later, after I was grown, I asked him about it. He didn't dodge the question. He told me the marks didn't match any animal he knew, and that what scared him most was how controlled it all looked. Like whatever did it hadn't panicked or rushed. It had just tried to take me, slowly without noise. I still sleep light. I don't camp. I can't stand the feeling of weight on my legs. That night didn't just scare me. It taught me that sometimes danger doesn't come fast or loud. Sometimes it waits until you're small and quiet and almost asleep, and then it just presses down and sees what you do. I remember being shaken hard enough that my teeth clicked. My name shouted over and over, hands grabbing my shoulders, but I couldn't open my eyes. It felt like trying to swim up through thick mud. Someone slapped my cheek, not mean, just scared, and another voice said my name again, louder this time. Then everything went quiet, like the sound had been turned off, and I sank back down into the dark, where I'd already been. The next thing I remember clearly was morning light pushing through the tent walls. My head felt stuffed with cotton, my tongue dry, my body heavy. I rolled onto my side and saw that I was alone. My sleeping bag was still zipped, tucked the way I always left it. For a few seconds I thought camp had started early and everyone else was already up. Then I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. No voices, no zippers, no movement anywhere. I sat up and felt wrong immediately, like I'd missed something important. Outside, the campsite looked stripped bare. Tents gone. Gear gone. Fire pit cold and scattered. My chest tightened, and I yelled for my counselor, then louder, calling names until my voice cracked. No one answered. I stumbled out of the tent, panic rising, convinced I'd been forgotten, left behind by mistake. I ran down the path toward where we'd parked the vans, my feet slapping the ground, my breath coming fast and shallow. Halfway there, I saw them, all of them. The whole troop clustered together, adults and kids, faces pale and drawn. When they saw me, the reaction wasn't relief. It was shock. One of the adults swore under his breath. Another grabbed me and pulled me close, like he was checking to see if I was real. They kept asking where I'd been, what happened, why I hadn't woken up. I didn't understand the questions at first. I told them I'd just woken up. That didn't help. My counselor knelt in front of me, his eyes red and rimmed with exhaustion, and told me they'd tried to wake me all night. He said they'd shaken me, shouted, even carried my sleeping bag a few feet before I slipped back down like dead weight. I laughed then, a short, nervous sound because it didn't line up with what I remembered. I told him that wasn't true. I said I'd been awake. His expression changed, just slightly, and that scared me more than anything else so far. He asked what I meant. I told him I'd been lying still because I was scared, because there was someone inside the tent with me. The adults exchanged looks. I felt suddenly stupid, like I'd said something wrong. I rushed to explain. I said I couldn't move, that my body felt heavy and wrong, like it didn't belong to me anymore. But my eyes had been open. I could see the tent walls glowing faintly. I could hear people shouting outside, calling my name. And standing near my feet, blocking the exit, was a person who wasn't supposed to be there. I said it wasn't one of the counselors. I knew that for sure. This person was too tall. Their head brushed the tent ceiling. They didn't move when people outside shouted. They didn't react when the tent shook. They just stood there, facing me, so close I could see the shape of them through the thin fabric of the sleeping bag. I couldn't see a face, just a darker shape where one should have been. I told them the worst part wasn't fear. It was the calm. Whatever was there didn't feel rushed or angry. It felt patient, like it had all the time in the world. When the adults outside finally stopped trying to wake me, when the camp grew quiet again, the figure leaned closer. I could feel the weight of its attention pressing down on me, heavier than any blanket. Then it stepped back, slowly. It lifted the tent flap without making a sound and left. I stayed frozen until morning because I was sure if I moved, it would come back. When I finished talking, no one spoke for a long time. One of the younger kids started crying. An adult told him to stop. My counselor asked me why I hadn't screamed. I told him I'd tried. My mouth just hadn't worked. They decided not to go back to the site. We packed what was left and drove straight to town. Later, they told my parents it had been a medical thing, sleep paralysis, stress, exhaustion. My parents wanted to believe that. I did too for a while. But here's the part that never fit. During the evacuation, someone had unzipped my tent from the inside. Not all the way. Just enough to look out. They found fingerprints on the zipper pull that didn't match mine. Too big. Too long. The camp director admitted that to my dad years later, after enough time had passed, that it didn't feel dangerous to say out loud. No one ever officially wrote it down. No report mentioned it. They said it must have been a mistake. A smudge. Something explainable. I'm telling you this because I know what being asleep feels like. I know what dreams are. That night wasn't either. I heard them try to wake me. I felt them touch me. And I watched something stand inside my tent while everyone else ran, convinced I wasn't there at all. I was adjusting my tripod and whispering to myself about exposure when my own words came back to me. Not right away, not like an echo off a cliff. They returned several seconds later, soft and exact, the same tone and volume, like someone had waited and then decided to repeat me. I froze with my hand still on the camera body, listening as the last syllable faded. The forest went quiet again, heavy and still. I told myself it was nothing. Sound did strange things at night, and I'd camped enough to know that. Still, I tested it. I said my own name, quietly, the way you talk when you don't want to draw attention. 5 seconds passed. 6. Then my name came back, same softness, same shape, not louder, not distorted. My stomach tightened. I waited, counting my breaths, and tried shouting this time, loud and sharp. My voice vanished into the dark and didn't return. That was the first moment real fear crept in. I wasn't panicking yet, but my mind started searching for rules. Quiet speech echoed. Shouting didn't. I tried clapping. Nothing came back. I spoke again, low and controlled, describing what I was doing out loud. The words returned after the same delay, every time. No change in distance, no direction. It didn't sound like it was coming from anywhere specific. It felt like it was coming from the space itself. I walked a few steps away from my camp and spoke again. Same result. I turned in a slow circle, listening carefully. But there was no sense of location to the sound. It wasn't behind me or ahead of me. It was just there, layered over the quiet. My skin prickled, and I realized I'd stopped breathing normally. I forced myself to slow down, to think like this was a problem to solve. I reasoned it had to be some strange acoustics. Maybe the terrain was shaped just right. Maybe temperature layers were doing something weird. I tried explaining that to myself out loud, keeping my voice calm. The explanation came back to me later, word for word, and hearing my own logic repeated stripped it of any comfort it had held. I decided to leave. That was the smart thing. I started packing, moving deliberately, narrating my actions without thinking about it. Every sentence returned. When I stopped talking, it stopped. When I whispered again, it answered. It was starting to feel less like an echo and more like a response that required permission. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed something else. The returned words weren't just delayed. They were timed. Always the same pause, down to the second. I tested it again, watching my watch face glow faintly. I spoke. I counted. Exactly the same interval. That consistency made it worse. Natural things aren't that precise. I tried one last experiment I regret deeply. I whispered a question. Is someone there? My voice sounded small in the open dark. The forest held its breath. Then, after the delay, the words came back wrong. Same volume, same tone. But the pause between words was different, like someone unfamiliar with how I spoke. Is someone there? I felt a cold flush run through me, sharp and nauseating. I didn't answer it. I didn't speak at all after that. I tightened my grip on the straps and started walking. The trail was faint, but familiar enough. I focused on my steps, on the physical act of moving forward. Behind me, the quiet pressed in, and for a while, nothing happened. Relief started to creep in, thin and fragile. Then I heard my own footsteps again. Not echoes. Not sounds of movement. The sound of boots on dirt, exactly like mine, returning after a delay. I stopped walking. The sound stopped. I took a step. 5 seconds later, the step came back. I clenched my jaw hard enough to hurt and kept moving, refusing to look around, refusing to speak, refusing to react. It followed me like that for a long stretch, never getting closer, never falling behind. Just repeating what I did, when I did it, after that same awful pause. My thoughts spiraled, but I forced them into order. If it only repeated, then it couldn't initiate. If it needed my action first, then silence and stillness were safety. I stopped completely. I stood there, pack digging into my shoulders, muscles screaming to move. The night was so quiet I could hear my own pulse. Nothing came back. No steps. No sound. I waited longer than felt reasonable. Still nothing. Carefully, I shifted my weight without making a sound. No response. That confirmed it. Whatever this was, it only mirrored what it could hear. I moved again, slow and controlled, minimizing noise. The trail took longer that way. But I made it back to my vehicle without another incident. I didn't speak the entire time. I didn't even breathe deeply. When I reached the car, I got in and sat there shaking, keys in my hand, waiting to hear something return that never did. The next day, in daylight, the place felt normal. Too normal. I went back briefly with a ranger, trying to explain without sounding unhinged. He listened, nodded, and said echoes behaved oddly sometimes. He suggested fatigue, stress, imagination. I didn't argue. I didn't need validation. What I learned that night was simple and unsettling. Something out there didn't want to chase me or scare me outright. It wanted to learn me, my voice. My movements, my timing, it waited, copied, and stayed just far enough behind to be patient. I stopped night camping after that. Silence, I learned, isn't just the absence of sound. Sometimes it's the only thing keeping something from answering back. I was crouched outside the tent, tightening a guy line, when I noticed the zipper wasn't where I'd left it relative to the ridge in the distance. That sounds small, but when you spend days setting up survey points, orientation becomes muscle memory. I stood, squinted, and felt a ripple of irritation. I'd aligned the tent door away from the wind and toward my equipment cases. Now it faced slightly left, angled toward a stretch of land I hadn't marked because there was nothing there worth marking. I told myself I must have misremembered. Fatigue does that. I grabbed my compass, checked bearings, and confirmed the tent was off by a few degrees. Not much, just enough to be wrong. I rotated it back, pressed the stakes deeper, and made a note in my field book, more out of habit than concern. When I zipped up that night, the door faced where I wanted it to, and that satisfied me enough to sleep. In the morning, I woke with the odd sense of being watched from a direction that didn't make sense. I unzipped the tent and felt my stomach drop. The door had shifted again. Same amount, same direction, always toward that same unmarked stretch. The ground around the stakes wasn't torn or disturbed. No drag marks, no signs of wind strong enough to move anything. The tent looked as if it had politely turned itself while I slept. I laughed once, quietly, because the alternative was letting the unease take root. I checked the compass again. Same result. I rotated the tent back again, this time marking the ground with a small rock at the front stake. I spent the day working, forcing my focus onto samples and notes. But my eyes kept drifting toward that direction, the place the tent seemed interested in. It was flat and dull, a low rise fading into nothing, unremarkable in every way. That night, I set an alarm to wake me every few hours. Each time, the tent was still. No movement, no sound. By morning, it had turned again, stopping at the same angle as before, like it knew exactly where it wanted to be. The rock marker was now a few inches to the side, undisturbed, mocking me. I felt a cold settle into my chest, the kind that doesn't come from temperature. On the third day, I stopped rotating it back. I wanted to see what would happen if I let it be. That felt like giving up a small piece of control, and it bothered me more than I expected. I positioned my chair and equipment, so I didn't have to face that direction, but I could feel it anyway, like a pressure behind my eyes. That night, sleep came shallow and uneasy, my dreams full of slow turning, of being gently guided without being touched. When I woke, the tent hadn't moved. Relief washed over me, quick and intense. Maybe it was done. Maybe it had reached whatever alignment it wanted. I stepped outside and followed the line of sight the door created, walking straight toward that empty land. The ground felt the same as everywhere else. But the farther I went, the heavier my thoughts became, like wading through something thick. About 100 yards out, I found a shallow depression. Barely noticeable unless you were looking straight at it. The soil there was packed harder, smoother, like it had been pressed down repeatedly over time. I knelt, touched it, and felt a faint warmth that made no sense. I stood quickly, heart racing, and walked back to camp without collecting a sample. That night, I rotated the tent away again, forcefully, resetting everything. I piled rocks around the stakes. I told myself this was ridiculous. In the morning, the tent had turned anyway. Same angle, same direction. The rocks were still there, shifted just enough to accommodate the change without breaking the pattern. That was the moment fear stopped being abstract. I called my supervisor on the satellite phone and reported equipment issues, asked for an early extraction. He hesitated, asked questions. I didn't tell him about the tent. I didn't have words that would sound sane. He agreed to send someone the next morning. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat inside the tent, watching the fabric, feeling it ever so slightly tense, like a compass needle settling. Just before dawn, I felt it move. Not fast. Not dramatic. A slow, deliberate rotation, the ground whispering softly under the base. I held my breath, afraid that acknowledging it would make it worse. When it stopped, the door faced that place again. Perfectly. I waited until full light before stepping outside. The extraction team arrived mid-morning. I watched their faces as they took in the setup, the angle of the tent. One of them frowned, checked his compass, then looked where the tent faced. He didn't say anything, but his silence told me enough. We packed quickly. Before leaving, I walked back to that depression one last time. It was cooler now, ordinary, empty. Years later, I still think about orientation, about how some things don't push or pull, they just guide. I don't camp anymore. I don't like waking up unsure of which way I'm facing. Some places don't need to move you themselves. They just teach the ground how to turn you, slowly, until you're looking exactly where they want you to look.